Hello, everyone. It is so good to see you again. We are here at EmblemCon Day 3. Thank you for joining us for yet another panel. We are here for a very informal presentation. Give a warm welcome to our returning panelists for this hour. Please go ahead and take it away.
Great. Hello everybody, and welcome to the Beta Builds a Fire Emblem panel for EmblemCon 2025. My name is Digital Dreams, and I will be your host in this explanation through the various beta and working builds of the Fire Emblem series. So throughout the next hour, I'll be telling you all about the developmental forms of various games in the Fire Emblem series, including a few demonstrations for beta builds that we actually have access to today. Also, as a note for the people who are joining on Discord, this stream will have a little bit of audio, but it is important that you have the stream audio kind of down a little bit because I will be talking over the video demonstrations whenever they happen at the end of the presentation. I'll give another reminder about that before we get started. Just have the stream volume at maybe 50% so that you can still hear me talking over it. And then before we get started properly, I want to go on and introduce myself. So I've been a panelist at EmblemCon since the very beginning, and this is my 6th year presenting and my 5th long informational panel. In the past, I've done presentations about cut content, glitches, lost media, and the various ways Fire Emblem games changed over the course of development. You can find all of my past informational panels recorded on my YouTube page, and this panel will be going up there too soon after the presentation ends, presumably sometime early next week. Outside of EmblemCon, I am a writer, and I've written a lot of stories for Fire Emblem over the years, including a full rewrite of Fates and over 400 cut fan-made support conversations for Tellias. So, safe to say, I have loved Fire Emblem for a very long time, and I've always been interested in the various forms of the game leading up to release. So for this panel, I did a bunch of research into the unreleased versions of various games, and I'll be sharing it all with you here at EmblemCon. I hope you're excited to learn about beta builds, because there are a lot of great ones across the series, including a few that you can play for yourself whenever you would like. So to start off with what the panel is going to be talking about, I'll be taking you through the 6 games we know about working builds for: Binding Blade, Blazing Blade, Sacred Stones, Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, and the unreleased Fire Emblem Wii. I'm focusing specifically on the known builds of these games and what we know about them, where they've been shown off over the years. All video games obviously have beta builds in some form or another, but the majority of our knowledge about these known builds with a lot of information around them is centered in the GBA and Tellius eras. I talked a lot about how games changed over the course of development in my presentation last year, so this will be focused specifically on the working builds we either know a lot about or have direct access to. We'll be going in chronological order for the series of release dates for these games for the informational segment of the presentation, and then after that, I'll be finishing the panel with something a little bit more hands-on. Some of you may know that we actually have access to beta builds for Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones because of a data leak in October of 2008, and they are freely accessible to the public now. I will be finishing off this presentation by giving a few demonstrations of the beta builds for these 2 games. We're going to be starting with Sacred Stones because that build is a little bit more bare bones and there's not quite as much to look into, so I think it's a good foundational build, and then Blazing Blade has a bit more interesting stuff that's more in-depth, so that one will be coming second. All footage in these videos was recorded by me, and I'm looking forward to showing you the most interesting parts of these beta builds, even if this presentation can't entirely capture everything about those specific prototypes. So without further ado, let's get started. So out of every game in the Fire Emblem franchise, Binding Blade is the one we know the most about in terms of beta builds, because this game had perhaps the messiest development cycle out of any Fire Emblem game ever. People make jokes about 3 houses, Binding Blade was worse. Binding Blade was released for the Game Boy Advance in March of 2002, but its story goes all the way back to 1997, 5 years prior. That was when Fire Emblem was confirmed to have a game in development for the Nintendo 64 in an interview. Shigeru Miyamoto declared that Fire Emblem 64 would be coming out in the second half of 1998, and the game was later announced in September 1998 as being called Maiden of Darkness. But none of that was meant to be. 1998 ended, and the release date passed everyone by. The game never came, and neither did any other news about it. It wasn't until January of 1999 that anyone mentioned Maiden of Darkness again. That was when Shozo Kaga stepped forward and said that Maiden of Darkness was becoming too ambitious for the Nintendo 64, and Thracia 776 would be developed as the next game of the series instead. Thracia 776 would later go on to be the worst-selling Fire Emblem game because it was released on the Super Famicom 3 years into the N64's lifespan. I don't know what they were doing. This era of Fire Emblem was very notably messy in terms of development, and things only got messier when the Fire Emblem Treasure Book was released later in 1999. Many fans thought this would be finally where they learned about Maiden of Darkness after no one had mentioned it for so long. However, the book didn't mention the game at all, and it was proof that Maiden of Darkness had once again been quietly postponed. Kaga left Intelligent Systems on August 15th, 1999, very shortly before the release of Thracia 776. It seemed like all attention was now going to have to fall on the N64 Fire Emblem game since there was nothing else to develop. But Maiden of Darkness wasn't a Nintendo 64 game. Not really. Instead, it was planned for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. Unfortunately, the disk drive was a commercial failure, and most games for it were very quickly canceled after it became clear that the console was crashing hard. This, combined with Kaga's departure from Intelligent Systems and the fact that it was struggling to function on its own hardware due to being too ambitious, culminated in Maiden of Darkness being permanently cancelled on September 24th, 2000. The game was instead declared to be reworked into a GBA game that was, at the time, set to be called Priestess of Darkness. Maiden of Darkness never saw the light of day, and because its development history was so rocky, we never actually saw any footage of it. Everything we heard about Maiden of Darkness was from interviews. The game never even made it to E3 or any other gaming presentation. For a long time, all we knew about Maiden of Darkness was that it was a cancelled N64 DD game that fell apart for more reasons than one person could ever hope to count. But all of that changed on November 11th, 2015, when the Making a Fire Emblem book was released. The book was released for the series' 25th anniversary, and it was largely focused on Awakening and Fates, but there were a few nuggets of gold in it. For example, we finally learned more about Maiden of Darkness after the game was left as nothing but a memory over 15 years prior. We have a single selection of Maiden of Darkness's script along with a screenshot of what the game looked like. The art style is very clearly a pre-evolution to the final style used in the GBA games, resembling a midpoint between the Thracia and Binding Blade art styles. Personally, I think the two characters here resemble Klein and Pent for the left man and Kath for the right girl. We know their names too, Ephraim for the man and Ray for the girl. A scripted exchange between them was also included in the Making a Fire Emblem book. On top of the script, the book gave us a few pictures of character concepts. Most of these characters wound up being unused in the final game, and we can't really see many traces of these characters in Binding Blade. However, their names are a different story, and a lot of the names found in Maiden of Darkness's developmental content did end up getting reused. Ray, spelled R-E-I, was changed to Ray, R-A-I-G-H, and was assigned to a completely different character, a boy instead of a girl as Binding Blade's male Dark Mage. Ephraim went on to be used as the name for one of the Twin Lords in Sacred Stones. Roy's original name was Ike, which went on to be used in Path of Radiance for that game's main character. Idun was also used in Binding Blade, though the character with her appearance looks very different in the concept art from the final game. Bors and Eliwood were two names that made it into the final game, albeit under very different circumstances. Owain was never used in a Japanese Fire Emblem, but it was given to a character from Awakening. His Japanese name was Yudes, but in English it takes inspiration from Maiden of Darkness. It's difficult to say if this was coincidental or on purpose, though. We have a few other names here too, though these were not used in the final game. Taki, Helen, and Lynette. Some concept art has no names attached at all. It's very difficult to say if we're ever going to get any other material from Maiden of Darkness than we already have our hands on. Intelligent Systems seems to have a bit of material from it so that they could use it for the Making a Fire Emblem book, but no one can say what form the game is in or if it's even functional. One of the main reasons it was scrapped was because it was becoming too ambitious for its hardware, even with the disk drive's increased strength to run games. So it was probably downsized and simplified a lot when it became Binding Blade. The screenshot we have implies that there could have been a base that the characters could move around in, or at the very least it could have existed as a space for cutscenes. In the end, this potential feature wound up being axed when the game moved to the Game Boy Advance. The development process for Binding Blade continued to be rough and experimental for a while, and it took quite some time before the game reached its final form. As such, we have a lot of examples of various beta builds, and the first comes in January of 2001. There was a Famitsu article published on January 19th, 2001, and that was where we saw our first hints of what would become Binding Blade. The first known screenshot of the game is a very early rendition of the battle screen. An enemy female mage is casting a thunder spell on Shanna, and multiple things about this image are interesting. For one, the health bars resemble swords and are very different from the simple bars of the final game. On top of that, the enemy casting the spell is female. In the final game, generic enemy mages are only ever male, so it's interesting to think that there was once a plan to be deliberate gender diversity among the enemy ranks. There was another screenshot of the game that surfaced just a few days later between Alan and a villager. This image was published in an issue of Nintendo Power. In this picture, I want to draw your attention to the sprite of an unpromoted female mercenary in the back. This sprite is present and unused in all three of the GBA Fire Emblem games since there's never an unpromoted female hero that you can recruit. Echidna comes promoted as a hero, and all the other mercenary units are male in GBA. It's interesting that this sprite has existed as far back as this first known build for Binding Blade on the GBA and still never got used. Unfortunately, these two pictures are all we really know about this build of Binding Blade. By the time we saw the game again, it had changed significantly in appearance, and the unique details of this build did not stick around for Binding Blade's next public spotting. Said next public sighting of Binding Blade was at Space World 2001. This is the most well-known of the early Binding Blade builds, and we have quite a bit of surviving footage of it. Even though we don't have the game's files, we have a promotional flyer, a magazine photo, a few screenshots, and even a pre-release trailer. The trailer is admittedly very low in quality because it's not a direct rip and instead somebody shooting a camera at the screen that was projecting the trailer, but I have brought it up anyway for us to go on and watch together.
いよいよファイアーエンブレムがゲームボーイアドバンスに登場。今主人公ロイが仲間と共に立ち上がる。可愛いけれどもかっこいい魅力あふれるキャラクターが大活躍。戦場での活躍がその後の展開に影響するバリアブルストーリーを採用。ファイアーエンブレム封印の剣。
There we go. So the UI is definitely getting closer to the final game, having ditched the sword HP bars for something much more similar to the Binding Blade we all know. The weapon icons here are still placeholders though, and they are taken directly from 32776 since the final ones likely weren't finished yet. Another interesting change is that during enemy phase, the player units and enemy units would switch sides, so that meant the attacking unit was always on the right in the Space World 2001 build. Interestingly, Lolina was going to be recruitable in Chapter 1 instead of in Chapter 8, like in the final game. A few other screenshots of this build show a Berserker getting a critical hit on a dragon, along with Roy fighting the game's first boss. The color scheme is slightly different, and it was less saturated than in the final game. Another poster of the Space World 2001 build has a collection of characters on it, and the bottom has screenshots of the game. A lot of the characters are on a lot of early recruited characters are on the poster, and for the most part, they look fairly similar to the final game. Another poster shows Roy and Lolina alone. You can see Roy's old design in this poster, and it certainly changed a lot before the final game. His in-game portrait was changed to fit his new design shortly before the game's release, but his map and battle sprites still use his original design with the spikier hair. An interview tells us that the original design was made to appeal more to younger children, though I have to wonder what younger children the developers thought would be playing a Fire Emblem game in the first place. I can only assume that was why the design was changed into its final iteration, because obviously this game is not meant for young children. There are a bunch of other builds of Binding Blade too, and there's a bit harder to classify because we don't really know what order they were made in. January 2001 and Space World 2001 are fairly easy to recognize, but there are a bunch of miscellaneous screenshots from other builds that came after Space World 2001, but before the release of the game. We'll start off with this build that has an early version of Chapter 2. The UI is slightly different from both the Space World build and the final game. We're getting closer to the release though, so the bulk of the game is still recognizable. As for differences though, the mountains have brighter colors, and the shading on them is purple. The village background used during conversations is different too, with smaller buildings and mountains. The villager in this picture looks a little bit different too. The next three pictures are not specifically assigned to any build, but it seems likely that they're from this early version Chapter 2 version of the game because of the shading on the mountain and the other choices of coloration. The purple mountain shading really is a standout feature of this build that makes it pretty easy to identify when compared to every other prototype. Next, we have another evolution of Chapter 2, but this time the colors are closer to the final game. The colors are subdued compared to the final release, and the purple shading on the mountains is gone. Instead, the mountains are shaded a bit closer to how they would end up in the final game. So we're steadily getting closer to how the game looks as of release. From here, we have two battle screenshots on the right and left, and they seem to use the same UI and colors. This implies that they are from another build, though they seem to come after the build that used darker colors in Chapter 2. Speaking of that build in darker colors, that seems to be the same one as the screenshot in the middle of Clarine and Narshan talking. The coloration of this conversation looks very similar to the previous build discussed on the last slide. Like I said, we have a lot of pictures and not a specific build to assign to most of them. For our last batch of screenshots, we have two that use the older UI from previous builds. It seems that this battle screen format was in use for a lot of the development cycle, and it was only changed close to the end of the process. The UI seen on the right is getting closer to the final game, but it's still not quite there yet. Funnily enough, we don't actually have any screenshots from Binding Blade's beta builds that use the exact same UI as the final game, adding more credence to the theory that it was changed to look like that pretty late on in the development process. All in all, we really don't know how many Binding Blade beta builds there are. We know that there are a lot of them, though. We can only name three specifically, those being Maiden of Darkness, January 2001, and Space World 2001, but there are a lot of miscellaneous unnamed builds that have never seen the light of day. Binding Blade had a very rocky development process, and the fact that it has so many unreleased builds that vary so notably from each other is proof of it. We're not done talking about Binding Blade builds just yet. There's still one more that needs to be talked about. The English translation that was planned to be released internationally, but never came out. Back in 2002, the plan was for Binding Blade to be the first Fire Emblem game to release overseas, but this never came to be. Nintendo of America announced that they would be translating Binding Blade into English and then releasing it into English-speaking regions, but this project never came to fruition. It is most likely this project was quietly shelved at some point during the development process. This build is a bit of a question mark because we don't know for sure if it ever existed. For all we know, Nintendo could have said they were going to translate it and then never even started. So there could be nothing from this build at all, meaning it would have only been a theoretical rather than something that actually existed. This build's existence is unconfirmed because we don't know how deep it was into development before getting shelved. If it exists, there's no evidence of it, aside from that statement saying they were going to translate it. We may never know for sure if this build ever existed, and nobody can really say for sure other than intelligent systems themselves. And I'm taking a quick water break because all this talking is drying out my throat. Hydrate before you dihydrate, kids. For our next two beta builds, we finally turn our attention to a new game because I'm sure you all are sick of hearing about Binding Blade. Let's talk about Blazing Blade. But we're not looking at promotional material this time to know what the game was like during development. We actually have proof of what it was like. In October of 2008, Intelligent Systems suffered a massive data leak, and three things from the Fire Emblem series were made available to the public. Two prototypes of Blazing Blade and one beta build of Sacred Stones. We'll be taking a look at all three, and we're starting with Blazing Blade. These two builds are known as 0206 and 0219, respectively. These stand for the dates when they were made, February 6th and 19th of 2003, so they're from around 2 months before the game's release. The game is fairly close to release since the game was set to come out only 2 months later, but there are still a few oddities in the code that I want to explore. These two builds have a lot of graphics that are different from the final game. First off, Ninian's dancer rings were initially scarves, and they have the same color schemes as their released counterparts, just as different accessories. Raven and Heath's hair colors were completely different, and we have different sprites for all three lords too. Lynn and Eliwood's sprites here were redone and repurposed to come out in the final game, but the Hector sprite shown here was completely cut out by the time of release. The prototypes have quite a few variations on the cutscene still images. Only 2 of them are exactly the same as they are in the final game, and those are from Lynn mode. Even so, there are a few images from Lynn mode that change between the prototype and the final game. Starting around the halfway point of the game, the images become much less complete, and some of them are only sketches that have no colors or shading. On the slideshow, you can see in the picture that in the desert that interestingly contains Eliwood and Ninian, though these two have been cropped out of the final version. Speaking of absences, all of the art here is also missing the sepia layer over the top so we can see the images in their original color before they were tinted yellow. As our last tidbit for this section, we have interesting character information that was uncovered in the prototypes. The 2 subjects of interest here are Eleonora and Igreen. In the final game, the code for 0x29 is a copy of Nils, but here it's a version of Eliwood's mother instead, and she is located close to the playable characters. The version of her in the final game has growth rates even though she only appears in cutscenes, so maybe this means she was going to be playable at one point in development? No one can really say for sure, though there are a bunch of NPCs over the series that have had growth rates without being meant to be playable. As for Igreen, she can be found in the line of code 0x2b. In the final game, this line is a copy of Vida, but here in the prototype, it's Igreen. Her weapon ranks are incredibly strange, though. A in swords, S in lances, and C in axes, despite the fact that her class is archer. Her affinity is different in this game from Binding Blade, too. Here, her affinity is anima, even though it was ice in Binding Blade. Because of how different this version of Igreen is from Binding Blade, I don't think she was ever planned to be playable. If she was going to show up at all, I can only assume it was for a cutscene or maybe a village cameo, since she was nowhere near close to being playable with all of these weird little things. So much like with Blazing Blade, Sacred Stone's beta build was released to the public when it was leaked during a hack of Intelligence Systems data in 2008. Later on, I'll be giving an in-depth demo of the debug map found within the game, since it is by far the most interesting part of the prototype. For now, though, let's take a look at a few other things found outside of the debug menu. First, we have portrait changes. There are a lot of smaller portrait tweaks, so I'm focusing on the biggest and most obvious shifts here. First up, Mulder's clothing is completely different in the final game. Ford and Kyle are interesting because they actually swapped colors in the Christmas Cavalier dichotomy. Ford used to be green while Kyle was red, and they were changed to reverse their color schemes at some point in development. The beta version of La Rochelle used Tana's design, and the same applies to Tethys and Nami. Tethys originally looked like Nami, but she received a new sprite when her old design was repurposed for Nami. In fact, this beta build implies that Nami was added much later on in development because of how incomplete she is in the debug menu, so this makes a lot of sense. Amelia was also added very late, and in this prototype, Tana uses Amelia's sprite when appearing in the story. Joshua is completely absent from this version of the game too, implying he was a later addition. He doesn't show up in the character scrolling option within the debug menu, and he doesn't show up on Chapter 5 at all, so he was definitely planned way later on. Next, we move into another set of changed graphics in the Tower of Valney. The victory screen for the map clear is very clearly a placeholder because of how flat and incomplete it is. We also have a different version of the world map that diverges from the final game's version in a few places. More specifically, it's missing a lot of the locations for specific chapters that were present in the final game. The prototype of Sacred Stones is interesting because it has a lot of maps in varying stages of completion. Some maps are almost entirely finished, while others are a bit less composed and look like this. The Lacta ruins are definitely on the messier side. Some maps function perfectly fine, some of them crash, and a third group looks simply unpleasant. I'm very glad this was changed before the final release of the game, and it's very obvious we were never meant to see this. Quite a few maps are similar to their iterations in the final game, but there are some that have a bit less in common with the released version of Sacred Stones. For example, the prototype's Chapter 6 was changed to be Chapter 11 of Erica's route in the final game. A new map was made entirely for Chapter 6. On top of that, Chapter 7 used to be Fog of War. I'm very glad that was removed because Fog of War is never fun to deal with. Up through Chapter 8, the game is actually decently complete, and there are even scripted events that happen with full dialogue. As you get deeper into the game, the maps become less and less complete, so we don't know all that much about the later chapters from the prototype. In fact, everything after Chapter 8 has no dialogue at all, and the maps become much messier. Some of them even have numbers showing through the textures, which you'll see later. Chapter 11 on both routes is outright missing, and Chapter 5X is nowhere to be found either. So Chapter 11 was probably added on later, hence the rearranging I mentioned earlier, and 5X, also a late addition. The endgame of Sacred Stones has not been created yet either, so instead it's just a clone of the Dragon's Gate from Blazing Blade. This only really scratches the surface in terms of intriguing things here, though, so if you're interested, I highly suggest checking out and playing this prototype for yourself. There's only so much I can go over here, but it really is an amazing build to look at. Path of Radiance has a bunch of different builds that we know about, since its pre-release process was documented very well. Before we get into the details about the various builds we know about, though, I want to say that Path of Radiance was never planned for the N64. A lot of people have seen beta versions of this game, and since they don't look much like the final game, they assume they were put together for the N64. That isn't the case at all. Path of Radiance started development after Blazing Blade, and therefore after the GameCube had come out. The game was in development from 2003 to 2005. The only Fire Emblem game that was ever on the N64 during its development was Binding Blade when it was known as Maiden of Darkness, and obviously that never came out. Our first known piece of information about Path of Radiance was a picture of Ike fighting an enemy soldier. There are a lot of strange tidbits in this picture, though. For example, the enemy is a soldier who should be using a lance, but he is instead holding a sword. There are impossibly low critical rates for killer weapons as well, so this probably isn't an actual screenshot as much as it is a mock-up and proof of concept for the first 3D Fire Emblem game. This screenshot came before Ike even used the name Ike. His beta name was Paris, a name that was reused for Ike's descendant in Awakening. Priam's name is, well, Priam in English, but in Japanese, he takes his name from Ike's beta name from early in Path of Radiance's development. Another water break. I love these panels. They're killer around my throat. The first known build we have for Path of Radiance is from April of 2004. We have a bunch of screenshots of it, and quite the healthy bit of information, too. We know there were two maps for this build, but unfortunately we only have screenshots for one of them. The map is rough and simple, and while it bears slight resemblance to the first chapter of the final game, it's still pretty different. There are 8 playable units here: Ike, Soren, Rolf, Titania, Reese, Leaf, Marcia, and Zehark, and they are facing off against Daean soldiers. The battle scenes seem to take place on the map, and they are zoomed in compared to the shots where the units are navigating the map. Maybe combat animations were planned to be direct zoom-ins at first before they became cutaways in the final game. The enemy units do not have distinct models yet, and they all pull from a model that would become the fighter in the final game. Reese uses a healing staff of some kind in one of the screenshots, and the particle effects are pink instead of teal like in the final game. Soren, meanwhile, uses a basic fire tome that uses an early version of the final game's L-Fire animation. The stat screen here is very different from the final game, and the background has a picture of the Tower of Guidance from Benyon. Constitution and weight are included with everything else, despite being sectioned off on their own in the final game. Titania's sprite looks a bit different, and she was originally planned to be primarily a lance user instead of an axe user like in the final game. The vulnerary in her inventory is blue here instead of beige. Here, Ike has a rapier. This weapon was replaced with the regal sword in the final game. The menu cursor is a metal gauntlet like in the final game, but is perched sideways instead of diagonally here. Lastly, we have a picture of a conversation between Soren and Leaf. This discussion between them is not present in the final game, but it is in line with their very strained relationship as is shown in Chapter 8 of the release game. This version of the game was never released publicly, but a slight evolution of it was made into a demo a month later at E3 in 2004. There aren't very many differences between the April 2004 and the E3 2004 build, so I've chosen to group them together because the E3 demo was of this map that you are seeing here. We don't have all that much information about the E3 build or the other map that was playable at E3 2004, but it was pretty similar to this version of the game. After that happened, we got another major build for Path of Radiance. This time it was in November of 2004, and the game received a demo for the Nintendo Touch World DS events that took place across Japan. This build is massively different from the E3 version, and it has made massive strides towards the finished product we know today. This demo had a version of Chapter 1 for players to sample to see if they liked the game. There are a handful of subtle differences from the final game, and the first of them is Ike's personal weapon. In the final game, the weapon is called the Regal Sword, and he receives it in Chapter 4. In this demo, though, Ike has the sword in Chapter 1, and it's called the Long Sword instead. This actually makes a lot of sense, since in the final game, the Regal Sword is referred to as the Long Sword internally, so the rename probably happened pretty late on in development. The dialog box and stat screen windows are slightly different from the final game. The dialog box has a light gradient to it, and the stat screen still has the Tower of Guidance in the background. Even though the dialog box looks different, the text is the same as in the final game. The font the text is shown in is simpler than the final game, which uses a serif font instead of a sans serif one. One unusual little tidbit about this version of the stat screen is that it includes the minor stat increases stylized like Lagoo's transformation stat changes. We don't know for sure where these increases are coming from, though. It could be terrain, support bonuses, an early version of biorhythm, or something else entirely. We're just not sure right now. In theory, we would know for sure if this build of the game ever got leaked or released somewhere. This is a full demo, much like the E3 2004 version, and it was playable at various kiosks across Japan, so we know that there is a playable form of it. It would be great if this somehow found its way into public hands one day. I know I would be there instantly to see what I could do if I wound up with the demo's files. Our next build takes us to November of 2004, and we have a bunch of screenshots published in Nintendo Dream for the month. So, around the same time as Touch World DS, but in a magazine. This build is much closer to the final game, but there are a few differences to note here. First off, the shove command is highlighted in yellow in the options menu, and in the final game, it's white, and the only yellow command is Ike's direct ability. The HP bars during battle scenes are slightly different, and the font for the number is italicized far more than in the final game. On top of that, the units' names are featured at the top of the HP bar when they are absent from battle animations in the final game. The enemy Myrmidons are covered in a faded blue, though they never appear with this color in the final version. Similarly, the bandits appear to wear an olive green color that resembles Radiant Dawn Brigands much more than Path of Radiance. Next up, we can see the stat screen. Titania's is very close to the final version, but it still has the Laguz-style stat increases that were removed from Bjork units in the release games. Her base stats are slightly lower here, and she doesn't start with her Iron Axe either. The vulnerary is still blue like in past builds, it's not beige yet. Soren's stat screen also has a few differences. First off, the Bjork unit type icon has a placeholder. He originally had a lower HP base stat, and Adept cost 5 fewer points of capacity than in the final game. So we're definitely getting closer to the game, but there are still a few differences of note here. I love water. Our next build takes us to January 2005. We have a bunch of images from a promo reel for Path of Radiance, and we're creeping closer to the final game, though there are still a few notable differences from the completed release. This build is different from everything that came before and after it, and that means we've got to talk about it now. First off, the HP bars are looking a lot more elaborate than in the final game, seeming more like Radiant Dawn than Path of Radiance. At this point, though, the far more interesting fact is that damage, hit, and critical stats are included during the battle animations where they're not in the final game. Path of Radiance is the only Fire Emblem game that doesn't show this information during combat, so it's interesting to see that it was once there and was later removed. The HP bars looked the same during map animations, too, as they did during the cut-ins. The level up window is getting closer to the final game, but it's notably less elaborate than the one we have come to know so well. The game was only 1 month away from release in March of 2005, so nearly everything seen in screenshots is the same as the finished game, with one exception. Soren's Elwind tome still doesn't have a complete icon, and it uses a plain placeholder tome instead. Elwind's animation is a lot duller, too. The enemy Myrmidon is wearing red here instead of orange, which is the color that enemy units use in Chapter 13 in the final game. Since this has to be Chapter 13, since this is the only boat map where Myrmidons appear as enemies. The HP numbers also look slightly different. The developers were clearly working on Path of Radiance right up to the last minute if there were still changes to be made a month before release. Our final build for Path of Radiance comes in the form of a third and final demo presented at E3 in 2005. This marks our final demo after the ones presented in E3 2004 and Touch World 2004. This one, however, is the first one to have been presented in English instead of Japanese. This demo is close to the final game, but it isn't there quite yet since the voice acting is still in Japanese and has not yet been dubbed over. This demo contains chapters 13 and 16, and they are set to the easiest difficulty, which would be the English region exclusive Easy mode. Unfortunately, this demo has not been seen since E3 2005, and we do not know anything about how the other chapters may have looked at this point in time. Obviously, it would have been pretty close to final release because the game had already come out in Japan by this point. It would have already come out in Japan at this point, but the English translation was still a work in progress. For Radiant Dawn, we have very, very few images of a beta build of Radiant Dawn, and we really don't know all that much about this game's time in development. The pictures we have are low in quality and were first shown in hands-on previews that do not have complete video footage. It might have been archived at one point, but it certainly isn't anymore. One picture has a draft of the title screen, which includes Ragnall, Alondite, a heron, and Laurent's medallion. Micaiah can be seen fighting Kanagus in another picture, and the background seems to be in some camp setting. Maybe it has something to do with the supply burning chapter in part 3. No one knows for sure. And then lastly, we have a picture of an early portrait for Nolan, and it is unsettling. Other than these 3 images, though, we don't know a thing about Radiant Dawn's beta builds. There must be a full build attached to these 3 images, even if they're different builds spread across them, but the details have been lost to time, along with any video footage of that hands-on preview. Our final beta build isn't really a beta build at all, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, it's a tech demo for a game that was never actually released. Fire Emblem Wii is a tech demo that was developed in the late 2000s, and it was an experimental game developed after Radiant Dawn's release. Most people didn't know this game was being made at all until after it had completed development. Much like with Maiden of Darkness, a lot of the information we have about Fire Emblem Wii originates in the Making a Fire Emblem book. The Wii tech demo was planned to be very different from the rest of the Fire Emblem series, playing as a real-time strategy game like Pikmin instead of the turn-based tactics Fire Emblem is known for. The game had a mode known as Field, where the player could control a group of characters through a world. The player could interact with NPCs, encounter enemies, and explore the map freely. When encountering an enemy, an icon would appear and the player would initiate combat after making contact with that enemy. The map was planned to include towns, buildings, caves, and more. The camera was set in third person, but could be altered according to the player's control. We don't know if the camera was planned to be more controllable than just zooming in and zooming out, though. The Making a Fire Emblem book doesn't say. Interestingly, the Wii tech demo may have been planned to take place in Tellius if it was made into a full game. The images of the demo include Stefan, Ileana, and Reese from Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. We don't know for sure if they were placeholders or if this is actually meant to be an expansion of Tellius' story, though. This is certainly a strange collection of characters to put together, so I'm willing to assume that they were placeholders, especially given the lack of major characters from Tellius. Fire Emblem Wii, as far as we know, was never really meant to release. There weren't any proper ideas to back it up, nor was there an objective in development beyond exploring the possibilities of the technology. We don't know if any builds of this game survived, or even if Intelligent Systems still has a copy of it. We also don't know how far the game got into development before it was shelved. We didn't even know it existed until the making of Fire Emblem book. There's just not all that much information about it, unfortunately. Even if a copy does exist, there's a strong chance it won't even be playable because of how incomplete the game might be. Fire Emblem Wii's legacy lives on, though, through Echoes of all games. The exploration concept was reused in Echoes, and the map contained in the Fire Emblem Wii concept art very closely resembles the maps in the bottom screen of Echoes on the 3DS. In that way, the spirit of Fire Emblem Wii has lived on, even though it was never meant to release. I would love to see Intelligent Systems revisit this idea of a real-time strategy Fire Emblem spin-off, but I doubt that will ever happen, especially since we didn't know Fire Emblem Wii existed until years after it had been shelved. Still, it's a very interesting part of this series' secret history. So for the last two segments of this panel, we will be looking at the prototypes of Sacred Stones and Blazing Blade. I will be going through a few things in each beta build and highlighting what I feel are the most interesting points of these two games. We're going to start with Sacred Stones because, like I said before, it's a bit further from completion, so there's not as much to look at, and the game is much less complete. After that, we'll be going into Blazing Blade, which is closer to release and has a bit more to sink our teeth into. There are a few unique things in Blazing Blade that do not have an equivalent in Sacred Stones, so we'll be covering the basics in Sacred Stones first, and then going into Blazing Blades for slightly more interesting and in-depth tidbits. I gave a reminder about this at the beginning of the presentation, but now is the time. If you are watching this on Discord, I highly suggest that you go into the stream settings and turn down the stream audio so that you can still hear it, but can also hear me talking, because I will be speaking over these demonstration videos for Sacred Stones and Blazing Blade. For the Sacred Stones section of the demonstration, I will be showing you all what you can do within the debug menu of the game. Much like with Blazing Blade, all the footage you see here was recorded by me, and it is also all in Japanese. So if you can't read Japanese and want to check this out for yourself, you'll probably want to have a guide pulled up so that you know what each option does. If you are interested in checking this out, Serenus Forest does have a full guide of everything that you can do in the game, translated into English. It's not a patch, but it is a web page that you can scroll through, and that will tell you what you are doing. Before we get into the video, though, I want to show up the debug menu that loads upon entering into the game. The first option, Release Entry, starts the game from the very beginning. Continue Chapter resumes an in-progress file. Manual Continue resumes a suspended file, like the middle of a chapter. Initialize File is meant to wipe all save data, but it doesn't work properly, so the function hadn't been fully implemented yet. The World Map will take a player to the world map so they can access a skirmish. The most important option is the one at the very bottom, where you can select what chapter you want to play. This goes through all of the maps, including the route split, sectioning off the maps as Erika or Urzark. Because interestingly, Ephraim's chapters here refer to him as Urzark, even though the rest of the build has already transitioned to calling him Ephraim. Interestingly, you can enter any chapter through scrolling through this list, though not all of them would work the way that you expect. If you hold L while opening a chapter, then tutorials will be disabled for the chapter. We won't be looking at any specific chapter from the final game, though. Instead, our attention here is going to be on the debug map and everything that you can do there. So, here's where our first demonstration begins. Upon loading into the debug map, you will hear a very notable difference from the final game. This is not the Sacred Stone soundtrack, as you can hear from the map transition, and now the song. This entire prototype uses the soundtrack from Blazing Blade, and our debug map uses Wind Across the Plains, Lynn's map theme from Blazing Blade. What if we wanted to change that, though? We would open up the map debug menu and scroll through the options. A lot of the options are identical to the final game. I'm going to pause here because the video goes faster than I can talk. A lot of the options in this pause menu are identical to the final game. Unit, status, options, retreat, suspend, and end. The next option, charge, lets you choose what army you can control. You can set the player or enemy units to be controlled by the computer, the player, or no one at all. And next there's the debug menu, and this is the one that we're going to be taking a look at now. The bottom option lets you change the music, and we can swap away from Wind Across the Plains into something else, though all the music is from Blazing Blade since the Sacred Stone soundtrack hadn't been implemented yet. It is worth noting that if you do this, if you enter a battle animation or do anything else to change the music through force, the song will reset back to Wind Across the Plains. As for the other options on the debug menu, let's go through them. Map will let you choose a chapter to boot up. Debug info toggles on the debug display. Weather lets you cycle through the various weather effects found in Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones. Playthrough lets you change what number your current playthrough is, up to 13. Clear will pop up with a text box, and when you scroll to the bottom, you can click Understood to set the file to its epilogue state, though I obviously didn't do that. The next line has tactician data from Blazing Blade, even though there is no tactician in Sacred Stones, and you can toggle the tactician on, change their affinity, and increase the number of tactician points you have. Good Night activates sleep mode, but you can exit this by holding L and R at the same time. So next up, we're going to take a look at the characters. First off, the enemy units are essentially clones of our army, though there are a few differences. For example, the enemy units have those strange tents with poison. Pausing again. Those are the prototype versions of the Gorgon eggs. I don't know if you saw them a second ago. I will back up. If you see the tents with poison, those are Gorgon eggs from when the developers were still figuring out how to make them work. They still don't entirely work here, but that's what they are. They don't have sprites or anything yet, and they're incredibly strange. That is what they are meant to be, though. So now we're going to take a look at our forces. Some characters have sprites that are pretty similar to how they look in the final game, but in other cases they're a bit less complete. I said before that Naomi was probably added much later on in development, and part of that is because her profile here is so notably incomplete when compared to a lot of the other characters. She doesn't have a portrait here when most of the other early recruits do. Interestingly, Inez is a monk here, despite being a sniper in the final game. Marissa is missing her sprite also, and we have playable monsters here. And they do have battle animations, but they are a bit clunky. Before we do battle animations, though, you might have noticed the numbers going up on Erica's stat screen, and I want to show off a couple of interesting things you can do in the character menu. First thing, you can change the stats of a character as much as you want. You can move them up or down so long as they remain within the limits of the character's stat counts. So for the sake of demonstration, I made Erica incredibly strong. In fact, we can do something else with her, too. We can toggle what weapon she is using, so if we go over to the weapons screen, I start scrolling through them to find a good one. Every single weapon from Blazing Blade is included here, so we can scroll through them until we find something we want. So, you can change her weapon level, which I do here so that we can give her a more powerful weapon, and then scrolling through the weapons. I decided to give her the Worm Slayer specifically because I think the sprite looks really cool. It's neat. And then we have her attack one of the enemy forces. I had her not attack herself, because if she attacks herself, it results in a game over, since she's the main character. Her combat animations are incredibly different from the final game, and she's also the only character in this entire army to have a custom battle color palette. And there's Wind Across the Plains resetting. There's one interesting weapon we can look at when going through the scroll here, so let's go on and do that for Ephraim. I cranked up his weapon rank with lances so that he can actually use it. And then, so starts to scroll through all of the weapons, which does take a second. You can see all of the sprites here from Blazing Blade, including the legendary weapons, actually. Like, you can fully give your characters the legendary weapons from Blazing Blade, but there is one important one here that is sort of apart from the rest of the weapons, and it is a lance, because all of the weapons from Blazing Blade exist here, and that happens to include Vida's Uber Spear. It's here, along with the mine, in case you wanted to do the mine glitch. So that's Vida's Uber Spear, and whenever you go over onto Ephraim's stat screen, which I promise I do in a second, you can see all of his stat boosts from the Uber Spear. And if you take him into battle, he also has battle animations. Unfortunately, he is just a clone of Ephraim. Not Ephraim, a clone of Elliewood, so he's obviously pretty incomplete. I mixed up my E-name lords. Another really funny thing that you can do in this, and you might have noticed it during the weapon scroll, is that you can put a ballista into the inventory of a female archer. Of an archer, I mean. So you can do it with Naomi, who uses the male archer battle animations, despite being a female archer. She uses Rebecca's animations in the actual story chapters, but here she uses the male archer model for some reason. So next up, I took us through a few battle animations for the monsters, and we can see that their animations are not complete at all either. Pretty much Erica's are the only ones that are complete, and hers are obviously different from the final game. The animations are incredibly clunky, but we can still see what they would one day become. On top of that, there are a couple of mysterious dark mages that are standing on our side. Those are not just any dark mages, those are summoners. And the summon feature, believe it or not, actually works here. I my script is a little bit out of order. Here's the demonstration of the ballista that happens. Obviously, you can hack a ballista into the inventory, and Naomi uses the male archer model despite using Rebecca's archer model if you play from the start of the game. It's weird. Anyway, here's the summoner, who can actually summon an axe wielder to fight with us. The axe wielder is kind of glitched out, though, and uses... Yep, that looks like a Mind Glitch, if you remember that from Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones, the enemy control glitch. So the sprite is pretty incomplete, but it is still functional. There are 2 more things to do in this demonstration, and it's visiting these 2 villages. The first one shows off every single map in the game, so you can see them all for yourself. Like I said, Chapter 11 had not yet been implemented, so it just kind of skips over it, and the game was planned to have 20 chapters instead of 21. There's the Chapter 11, the Chapter 6 that would later become Chapter 11. Fog of War is also disabled in all of these, and some of these maps are a lot buggier than others. You can see the numbers in between the tiles there. The scroll through the maps is obviously not perfect, and our units just kind of get plopped down onto whatever tile matches their current position, regardless of if it's a space they can actually stand on. This is just to kind of scroll through and see how complete the maps are. Some of them have kind of messy textures and are not finished. And coming up in a second, you'll be able to see what I mentioned before about how the end game has not been finished yet. That is just the Dragon's Gate from Blazing Blade. And then Ephraim's maps here are coded with an I. The previous maps are all Erica's, because Ephraim is still referred to as Urzark in the code, which is weird because, like I said, the prototype refers to him as Ephraim at this point, but Urzark was his first name. So I guess they kept the I so that they could distinguish between Ephraim and Erica's maps during this scroll. I'm not entirely sure. That's my best guess at it. And we're about to finish up with the map scroll, which means that we are going to enter the other house. So I mentioned before that there are a bunch of different sprites that are distinct. Here we can see a couple of like debug testing menus, and we're right back to where we started. So I mentioned before that there are some different sprites for different characters, so let's see some of those in actions. If you click B at a slow pace, then they'll go across the screen as normal. I'll tell you what happens if you go too quickly. So here through this, we can see a few oddities. We're going to come up on the first one in a second. Inez used to be Artur, which is hence why he shows up here as a monk instead of a sniper, and he takes Artur's place in the character lineup, which is done in recruitment order. All of the other sprite changes from before are also in effect, like Amelia being Tana and Tana being Lara Shell. Kyle's original sprite didn't have a proper blinking animation, so whenever we come up to that, you are going to see that he glitches out quite a bit whenever he shows up. Ephraim's sprite is pretty different. Joshua is entirely absent from this lineup, like I said before, and he doesn't even have a blank portrait placeholder to see walk across the screen, because he must have been added incredibly late on in development. I played this prototype up through Chapter 8 to see, what the changes were. Obviously, Chapter 6 is completely different. There's Tethys using Nami's sprite. Whenever I played through the game up through Chapter 8, Joshua was just completely absent. There was no placeholder version of him. He was just not there. There you could see Tana's sprite being used for Lara Shell, because obviously she's right next to Dazla and Renak. The sprites here become a lot less complete. There's Myrrh. And then they start slowing down in terms of interesting stuff because the later sprites hadn't been finished. And then this is what happens if you click B too quickly. The sprites start stacking on top of each other, and they cannibalize the game, and that right there is a soft block, and therefore that is where we will be leaving off here. So if you would like to check out the rest of the Sacred Stones prototype, it is freely available on Serenus Forest, and there are a lot of interesting things to dig into that I obviously couldn't show you right here. If you find this cool, then I really recommend checking it out, because I love Sacred Stones, and I love this prototype too. And then, last up, we have the Blazing Blade demonstration. We will be taking a look at the 0206 build of the game. I'm sure some of you are wondering, why 0206 and not 0219? This is because there are a few interesting debug menus that are present in 0206 that have been removed by the time of 0219. And since Sacred Stones was our basic debug crash course, I wanted to do something a bit different with Blazing Blade. So before we get into it, here's the menu that you see upon loading up the prototype. It is pretty much the same as Sacred Stones, except there are actually villager sprites here instead of the blank placeholders in Sacred Stones. So you can select any map you want to play manually, but the characters will have their base stats instead of being scaled to fit the current chapter of the game. You can also start the game from the beginning, though some maps will become less complete and messy as you get deeper in. We're going to be taking a look at the debug map and playing around a bit with that, and more specifically, we'll be looking at the character menu that is only found in the 0206 build. Upon loading into the game, we have the same menu as what we saw in Sacred Stones, and we're going to load into a map labeled Test. Upon opening it, Elliewood moves, and a dialogue exchange pops up. And it's interesting. I'll just put it that way. Our debug menu is obviously different. There's Elliewood moving, and then, yikes. Okay, then. After that, it goes back out into the rest of the map, and we can look at the units. We don't have any music, unfortunately, by default. Since this map was from around 2 months before release, a lot of things here are pretty complete, but Merlinus is an exception. If you noticed a second ago, his little tiny sprite is just a recolored version of Roy with blue hair and green clothing. There's something else odd about this map, though, and that would be the presence of a female thief, because there aren't any female thieves in Blazing Blade, and that is correct. But this female thief, if we open her up, it's Layla. I don't think she was ever intended to be playable or anything, but it's still very interesting that we can find her here in the debug menu in some form or another. She doesn't have a smaller sprite preview on the map since, again, she was never really meant to be seen in this way, but it is her. This map has a very strange set of units on it in general. We have Elliewood, Hector, Ninian, Barter, Jafar, Vida, Urk, Priscilla, Luis, Layla, and Merlinus. Much like in Sacred Stones, we can turn their stats up and down as we so choose, and we can do the same to the enemies. So, I think I choose a knight that I want to mess with. But I think I first mess with Urk, yeah. My favorite characters in Blazing Blade, so call it a little bit of favoritism, but I did want to make him the superpowered one for this version of the build. But I mentioned before that we can turn stats up. We can also turn stats down, which I do in a minute, I'm pretty sure. I'm a little bit slow whenever I was recording this demonstration because obviously I can't read Japanese, so I was just I was doing my best as somebody who cannot read Japanese. There we go. Turning the speed, turning all the stats down. This knight is utterly useless now. Interestingly, during one of my tests for this originally, the knight, whenever I turned his stats down all the way, his speed stat turned into just 2 bars instead of a 0, which is incredibly strange. The villages here are meant for testing various conversations, so if we go to this one in the middle, we can see a conversation between Jafar and Nino, and even though Barter was the one who entered the house, Elliewood shows up. From there, we can click through the dialogue options to see Elliewood's various sprite changes throughout his different expressions over the course of the game. Interestingly, it's Elliewood here, again, regardless of who the visiting character is. These 3 houses on the top row cycle through a bunch of locations in the game, and no text box shows up on any of them. I won't be going through all of them for the sake of time, but I will be going through the locations on this 3rd house in the row of 4 because one of the backgrounds is notably broken. You can see the little triangle up there in the top left corner from where the dialogue scrolls through, even though there is no dialogue box matched with it. The 2nd row of houses that was a little bit below this does a very similar thing to this, is scrolling through all of the locations, except instead of locations, it scrolls through all of the character sprites. The 1st house is for playable characters. There's the messed up one. The 1st house is for playable characters and major NPCs. The 2nd is for bosses and antagonists, and 3rd is for minor NPCs. All individual sprites are displayed separately here, so there are also different showings for expression changes, and they have their own sections. So next up, we are going to take advantage of something I didn't do during Sacred Stones, but I did mention that you could do it, and that was control the enemy units. You can set both sides of a battle to be controlled by the player here, so we're going to do that, and when you end the player phase, here you go. We're controlling the enemy without even needing to use the enemy control glitch, and we're going to have our super weak knight attack our super-powered Urk, and that ended exactly how I thought it would. It's very cool that you can do this in this version of the game, and it's especially ironic since the final game obviously has a glitch that lets you emulate this, and it is one of the most famous glitches in all of Fire Emblem. And this time I loaded a save state here because we're about to do something else. We're going to look at the character debug menu. You can open this up by holding down select and then hitting start twice. And I choose to do it on Hector. The 1st option here lets you max out a character, so we'll do that to Hector. You can set the HP of the character to be less than full if you would like, and you can also influence their attack and movement AI. The 2nd option from the bottom, recovery, controls their AI when they have a healing item in their inventory. Lastly, condition lets you cycle through any status you want. Be careful not to scroll through far though, because if you do, that'll happen. That is a soft lock, and that is the reason I made the save state. So we're going to go next to the actual reason that I wanted to show you guys version 0206 instead of 0219, and that is the battle debug menu. It was removed by the time of the 0219 build, but we can do it just fine here. So to open it up, you hold down L and R at the same time, and then press B. I think it can be a little bit finicky sometimes, but there it is. Okay, so now we're on this menu. We can change all sorts of stuff and simulate any battle we want. The order of the options are as follows. Name decides what characters will fight. Class will determine if the units are promoted or not. Though if you do this if you try to scale down a pre-promoted character, they will remain in their base class. I'm going to pause for a second. Army changes the character's colors to show whether they're a player, enemy, or NPC. Weapon decides the weapon type, and if you want to play around with this, you will have to set the weapon type to a type of weapon that the specific unit can use. Otherwise, the simulation just won't start. Lastly, action will show what the character will do in battle, and both sides have to agree, so you can't have one say that they're going to heal while the other says they're going to fight. You also can't have two units attack at the same time, and the simulation won't start if you do that. So, with all that out of the way, let's do what we came to do, which is simulate some battles. So, the default here is to set Eliwood, so I had Eliwood fight Eliwood. We had put them both at tier 2, gave one of them a sword and one a lance, and then set their battle commands so that it all worked out. The base option is 0, and that's for an attack. So for the other Eliwood, we'll go over to 6, because that means standing still. Letting our Eliwood take the attack, and just like that, there's a battle. These battle simulations have no chances of missing or critting, and both spots have dashes in them instead of numbers, and all attacks will do 10 damage regardless of any other factors. Interestingly, there's something else you can do in this simulation mode, and that is trigger boss conversations. With our first slot, we're going to give Hector an axe and set him to his tier 2 class. With our second slot, we are going to number 77, which stands for Darren, and we'll give him a lance. Now, when we start the simulation, we will see Hector's boss conversation with Darren play out. Interestingly, we can get two versions of Darren's sprite here since he starts at tier 2. Trying to knock him down to tier 1 won't downgrade him from general to knight, and it'll instead just change the colors of his sprite from tan to blue. The boss conversation doesn't trigger a second time if you redo the simulation repeatedly, so it's only readable that first time. There's a lot of fun stuff that you can do in this character simulator, but to my knowledge, there's not a set list of what number corresponds to what unit, so you'll have to do a little bit of trial and error if you can't read Japanese, but in theory, you can set up any fight you'd like here. It's a very cool addition, and I think this alone makes it worth it to check out the 0206 prototype. Again, this menu is completely absent from the 0219 version, so if you want to see it, you'll have to play version 0206 specifically. I think everything here is really cool, though, and I highly suggest you all check it out and see what these amazing things have to offer. And with that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you all for coming and listening to me ramble about Fire Emblem's various beta builds. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I hope you all learned a little something new. If you want to support me in other ways, you can find my social media listed on the screen. If you have any questions for me, you can refer to my Ask box. I'll also include my YouTube playlist with my past EmblemCon presentations in the Discord chat. For anyone who wants to see them, it is also in my panelist introduction if you want to check that out. You can reach out to me on social media if you have any questions or want to talk. If you're interested in learning more about these beta builds, the 3 best places to look are the Lost Media Wiki, Serenus Forest, and the Cutting Room Floor. All 3 websites have a lot of amazing information that I use to put all this together, and you can learn a lot from any of them. You can also find the prototypes for Blazing Blade and Sacred Stones in Serenus Forest if you want to play through any of them. Thank you all again for coming, and I hope you have a wonderful EmblemCon.
Alrighty, everyone. That concludes this panel. Thank you, Digital Dreams, again for joining us once again this year. These panels are always something myself and others definitely look forward to every year.
I always have a lot of fun doing them, and I will come back to EmblemCon for as many years as you guys will have me.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to it. Okay, everyone, stay tuned for our next panel. We're doing another draw from memory with more of our artists attending EmblemCon. So, that's about it for this one. Okay, everyone, take care. We'll see you in just a few short moments.